Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi. Welcome to Lecture 2 on the history and philosophy of psychology. This week, we're going to look at antiquity and early Greek philosophy. So we're looking at the origins of philosophy. The question that I'd like to open with is, where do we begin? And to answer this question, of course, we could begin a variety of places. It could be 1879 with the popular year that experimental academic psychology was established in Leipzig by Wilhelm Wundt. We could start perhaps in the beginning of modernity with René Descartes and his meditations on methodology of doing science. But I propose that we look to the model that G.W.F. Hegel proposed in his lectures on the philosophy of history. We discussed this book in our first lecture. And in Hegel's account, we begin doing history of science and the history of philosophy with the oldest civilizations and the oldest written civilizations and text that we have. And for that reason, we're going to begin not only with the Western philosophy, with ancient Greeks, but we're going to look at Eastern philosophy. So often we point to the earliest thinking in the oral tradition of Muthos, of myth, that was handed down from the oral tradition of mostly Homer in the West in ancient Greece. And these two texts really dominated ancient Greek way of thinking. This is the Iliad and the Odyssey. And to understand how philosophy of living, a life philosophy, how to act, what was the good life, what to do in certain situations, even origin stories of how we got here was largely handed down through mythology. Now, we use this term myth not to mean lie or not true. We use myth as a narrative, as a story. And in the ancient world, in antiquity, in the oral tradition and even into the written tradition, around 750 BCE, the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down into text. Before that, they were memorized by school children. If you read these texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll find what the ancient Greeks prided and privileged as the characteristics for ethical life and for a good life and how to live and how to live the honorable life. And I'd recommend that you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, study these both, even go into possibly watching some of the films that have been made recently. Troy is the story of the Iliad. The Odyssey has many versions. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey have many filmic versions that you can explore online. Or if you have the time, sit down and read them. They're very insightful. And we want to understand these as not just stories, but as mythological instruction manuals, as philosophies for living. So Homer, we really look to 750 BCE when these were written as texts for the first time, and we often understand history as beginning with the writing, with things being written down that we can access and discuss. So we look to Homer in 750 BCE as one of these earliest traditions. Of course, along with Homer, as we will study in a few moments, are the mythologies of the Olympian and Dionysian religions of ancient Greece. It's often said that the oldest religion in the world is Indian religion, and we, of course, are discussing this as Indian philosophy. We're talking here about Hinduism and the antecedent movements of Hinduism, which are referred to as the Vedic religions or the Vedic culture. And this is pre-8th century BCE, and one of the most influential texts that we have that influences Western philosophy, particularly Arthur Schopenhauer, are the Upanishads. And we want to consider the incredibly complex nature of this Vedic tradition that goes into the Hindu tradition, and of course how it leads into Hinduism and into Buddhism eventually. So the Upanishads, Schopenhauer said in The World of Will and Representation, his 19th century remarkable work that we'll be studying, he says in the introduction that if you want to begin with this text, you should begin with the Upanishads first. And then Freud later said if you want to study psychoanalysis, you should begin with Schopenhauer. The world is will and representation. So we see this tradition that can be traced back very interestingly. We're not living in an isolated world by any means. There are crossovers between Eastern and Western philosophy. Western philosophy influences the East, and Eastern philosophy definitely comes to influence Western philosophical thought in ancient Greece. In China, Chinese philosophy of 6th century BCE, the Tao Te Ching, this is Lao Tzu, and we're looking at Taoism, and one of these the very mercurial and interesting worldviews that come forth from Chinese philosophy that later influences Buddhism as well. We find here what Hegel points out in his philosophy of history of philosophy. We find that what really makes the Eastern tradition of this time different from the Western tradition is the absence of a distinction between subject and object. So certainly here in our time, as influenced by Descartes' philosophy of dualism, we have the assumption that there is an object that we have a subjective experience of. And this idea is absent largely in Eastern philosophy, a subject-object distinction. This is a little difficult for us to wrap our heads around because in the West, we are often brought up understanding, even written in our grammar, the world as a place that has objects in it, then that we have a subjective individual experience of those objects. It feels commonsensical. Well, this worldview, this system of knowledge is largely anchored in and rooted in our language and in our philosophies. And in Eastern philosophy, this is largely not the case. There is not a distinction between subject and object. We have what we might call today an intersubjectivity. We are participating in doing the world. We're living in the world, with the world. So this is one distinction of how Eastern philosophy was much different than Western philosophy. Confucius in the 6th century wrote the 5 classics of Chinese text, poetry, and ethics, and in particular a book that has been influential in the West, especially with the psychodynamic analytic psychology of Carl Jung, was the I Ching. And the I Ching, the Book of Changes, was a text that was used mostly as a projective method for answering questions. And you can get this book today, and there are online versions, and it's basically a group of philosophical poetic texts that are rather ambiguous and sometimes rather direct. And this book is used as a book of manifesting change in one's life. So you would go to this book with a question, you'd ask the question, you would then roll coins or throw straws, and part of almost like a chaos theory, you leave it to chance to a specific verse would be presented to you by the coin tosses in a certain hexagram. And you would look at this book and consult the text and find your answer within the text. Carl Jung proposed that it's actually functioning as a projective test. In other words, we're projecting our own unconscious thoughts, desires, fears, hopes, etc. onto the poetry that we read. So every time, to many different individuals, every time they get the same poetic verse, could be reading something entirely different into that verse based on their individual approach to the verse and their individual question that they're asking, the problem they're resolving. So this is part of Confucius' Chinese philosophy, and Confucius is largely remembered as a philosopher of ethics on how to live. Now, Buddhist psychology begins with Siddhartha, and this is around the 6th century BCE in Nepal and India, eventually moving and integrating into Japan and becoming mixed with certain Japanese religions, known as Zen. At this time, it becomes Zen Buddhism in Japan. We have different manifestations of Buddhist philosophy. Again, this is very important today because Buddhist psychology is one of the major areas of study in contemporary psychology. So again, another one of the Eastern philosophies that are eliminating, not even eliminating, there's not present the idea of the subject-object split. and is now functioning in Western psychology to eliminate this concept of the subject-object split in Buddhist psychology. And of course, we have the Judeo-Christian Islamic philosophies. And these begin somewhere around 600 BCE when they're written down for the first time in the Pentateuch with Judaism. And we have here a very interesting lineage. And of course, we are discussing all of these theologies or these religious/philosophies of living as historians and philosophers, not as religious. We're not discussing these internally. So when we say that the Chinese philosophies are the oldest, the Vedic tradition is the oldest, according to historians, we're taking this based on the rules of history, on how we do historiography. Of course, this might not be in agreement with a religious point of view. So, but we're not talking about Judeo-Christian Islamic philosophy or Hinduism or Buddhism from within the religion. We're talking about it as historians. So historically speaking, the Pentateuch is written somewhere around 600 BCE. This is the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. So we have this view of Judaism that's established in the 7th century BCE. Roughly speaking, in Christian philosophy begins around the year 32 CE with the death of Christ. Christianity is understood to be a mixture of Hebrew Judaism and Greek philosophy, in particular Platonic, the philosophy of Plato. And this is a manifestation into Christian philosophy. In the 7th century, in the 600 CE, we have the manifestation of the third of this Abrahamic religion, which is Islam. So we have this rich philosophy. We'll be looking at the Islamic influence on Western psychology and science later in this course. So let's look now at the Muthos, the myth. This is mostly poetic and oral tradition. Written examples are as early as 8000 BCE. And in 2700 BC, we find Sumerian cuneiforms. This is all originating in the Middle Eastern areas. This is an interesting quote from H.G. Wells. Writing puts agreements, laws, commandments on record. It made the growth of states larger and the old city-states possible. It made a continuous historical consciousness possible. And the command of the priest or king and his seal could go far beyond his sight and voice and could survive his death. And H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer who wrote two texts on the history of man, on history, one large and one brief, points out that history really begins with writing. Once we've written something down, we have something that we can return to and compare different versions with. In the oral tradition changes from ear to ear. If you ever play the game Telephone, where you whisper in someone's ear and they whisper in the person next to their ear the same message, and it continues around 10, 15 people. By the time that message gets to the last person, it's often changed dramatically. This is interesting in the oral tradition. It's not a verbatim record. It's something that's passed down and changes with each retelling. In written text, from this transition from oral to written text, we have the first concept of fact comes into place. A fact is that which is referenced back to writing down. The idea of fact didn't exist in the way it existed previous to written culture. So we look now at the Pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And we see here a painting by Raphael. So this is a Renaissance depiction of the school of Athens, and we see here various philosophers of Pre-Socratics, what we call the Pre-Socratics, and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And I'd like to call your attention to the center of the frame. We have here two figures. And if you notice, one figure is pointing up to the heavens, and the other is pointing down here to earth. And this is really central to our philosophy class, to our history of philosophy. Pointing up is Plato. And Plato is saying truths exist in the heavens, in what he called the ideal forms. And we'll be going into detail about this. But in other words, he's saying if you want to know where reality exists, where to look for the answers, look to the mind, look to the ideal forms, to thinking about things. And we see here Aristotle, who was the student of Plato's, disagreeing and saying, no, answers to questions are found here on earth, on the physical realm. He's pointing down to the physical. And this would be, in essence, the idea of natural science, that we look at objective realism, and in other words, empiricism has the roots here, that we look at the natural world to find our answers, whereas Plato is arguing, pointing to the heavens. No, we look to the rational world, and rational meaning the world of thought. We can look and find all of the some of the folks we'll be talking here, but all these ancient figures from antiquity and ancient Greece. And here's a little chart showing you who is who within this painting. We have Zeno and Epicurus and Boethius and Anaximander and Pythagoras, all in this painting by Raphael. Of course, this is a Renaissance Western European depiction of what these folks looked like. And so they, as we know from reading history in the past lecture, these are going to be depictions that look more like Renaissance, Western, Italian Renaissance individuals than what the ancient Greek and Middle Eastern philosophers actually looked like. When we discuss ancient Greek philosophy, we really will be looking at three periods, three traditionally divided periods. We have a traditional discussion of the Pre-Socratics, which is from antiquity up to around 470 BCE. We then discuss Socrates / Plato, which is a period of 470 to 347 BCE, and then we discuss Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. So we really want to think Pre-Socratics, and then Socrates and Plato and Aristotle as three distinctly different periods of ancient Greek philosophy. And these were incidentally distinct for the question of what they were looking into. So when we look at the earliest, the Muthos, the pre-civilized, the prehistoric humans, we have a few concepts that are really present in this entire idea of the myth and the Muthos. And these concepts are animism, that's the idea that everything is living is living with a soul, and anthropomorphism. And anthropomorphism is the idea that everything has human characteristics. So we look at everything in this Muthos tradition of ancient Greece as having almost like having a soul, having an animated soul, and having personality characteristics. And those personality characteristics are very similar, we find, to human personality characteristics. So again, we might even go as far as to interpret this as looking into the world and seeing ourselves in the world. R. Waterfield gave a great description of this. All systems of belief evolve to elucidate the order of things and to make sense of the world. In this case, science is just as much a myth as anything else. It is a framework or model designed to explain and form reality for those people who accept it. That is, for those people who voluntarily become members of that society, and for only as long as there are enough people to accept it. If this is so, then so far from banishing God, science has merely been the matrix for a new generation of scientific gods, children of the gods. So this is how we look at this idea of the Muthos, the myth. The myth is not a lie. It's a story that's constructed to explain things. And this critic of science is saying that in this way, our contemporary ways are stories of themselves. Our contemporary myths that we call science are no different than how the individuals of antiquity viewed their stories and explanations. In ancient Greece, we find that there are largely two traditional religions, that is the Olympian religion and the Dionysiac Orphic religions. we can explain the Olympian religion was usually practiced by the upper class Greeks, and they were a society that was largely reflected in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These are honor, victory, and the good life is what was celebrated. And of course, in the non-upper classes, the slave classes, the peasants, the laborers, it was largely worshippers of a Dionysic, Orphic religion. The word Orphic, one of the words orgy has its linkage with this Orphic religion, Dionysius and Orphic, and the Bacchus, the god of wine, and this was about wine and frenzy and poetry and prophecy and this animism in a more organic form. So we have these distinctions between the Olympian religion that's largely celebrated and believed in by one class of ancient Greeks, and the Dionysic Orphic religion, which is the predominant religion of another class of ancient Greeks. When we talk about the Pre-Socratics, we're largely talking about this list of philosophers: Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno, Pythagoras, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus. There are others, but these are the Pre-Socratics. These are the people who came before Socrates, historically, chronologically. And we're going to explore each of these individual philosophers. And we're also going to explore another group of intellectuals and thinkers, and these are known as the Sophists. Now, the Sophists and the Pre-Socratics, the Sophists continue to exist and to teach and think with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Up to this day, we have individuals who manifest from the Sophist tradition. This is a group of individuals that the definition of who they were will largely depend on the position taken as a historian of psychology or a historian of philosophy. So largely the Sophists were teachers. But there's a main distinction between the Sophists and the Pre-Socratics, the Sophists and Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And it goes something like this. These philosophers that we're looking at, the Pre-Socratics, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, had a tendency to believe that one could get to ultimate big T truths. In other words, if one follows some of the rules of logic, the rules of natural philosophy, the rules of mathematics, one could get to ultimate truths. The Sophists dismissed this idea of ultimate big T truths and said that the truth is dependent on the rhetorical context. So this means that there are no big T truths, there are only little t truths within context. So to this day, we have two traditions in philosophy: analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. Continental philosophy is largely seen as usually views the Sophists as what Nietzsche would call relativists. And the Sophists, the most recent lineage of the Sophists would be postmodernism, most postmodern philosophy. So this is Sophists being viewed as tricksters or non-philosophers or non-thinkers has both truth and untruth to it, depending on how you frame this idea. I would like to propose to you that you think of the Sophists as individuals who were largely relativists in the idea of truth. So these are thinkers who were incorporating language and rhetoric into the idea of having multiplicity or duality of truths, a plurality rather of truths. And the other philosophers, Pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle after the Pre-Socratics, as having a sense that there was an ultimate big T truth that you could get to through philosophical method. So largely we're looking here firstly at the Pre-Socratics. The first philosopher in the history of ancient Greece is Thales. And Thales is known as, of course, the first philosopher. And you see here in this chart where philosophy branches off from myth and religion. And right here at this intersection, this branch here, Thales would be. And Thales and the other Pre-Socratics continue on this quest of philosophy until we get to an individual, Immanuel Kant, in the 1700s. And this is where this split of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy exists. And we'll come back to this chart in the future. So Thales. Thales lived around 625 to 547 BCE, and he was interested, as were the other pre-Socratic philosophers, with answering the question, what is the ultimate stuff? What's the absolute? So what is everything made of in reality? And Thales proposed that the phusis, the thing that everything is made up of, the absolute, is water. And we can remember this idea because Thales famously, as Plato told us, was walking one day looking up into the skies, dreaming as the philosopher did, and thinking in his head, and he fell into a well. So this is Thales. Thales is known as the first person to predict accurately an eclipse. And one of the criticisms we find in writings about Thales is that people of ancient Greece dismissed Thales as doing something useless, this philosophy, based on the fact that he was poor. And there is a story that Bertrand Russell retells in his philosophy of history, in his History of Philosophy book, in which apparently Thales had insight using natural philosophy, had insight into there being a great growing season of olives. And he predicted that there was going to be a real boom in olive growth. So he went out and rented and purchased all of the olive presses he could get his hands on. And then when the olive season came, it was this great, this booming olive industry all went to him to rent the machines to press the olives. And of course, this was his message to people that had philosophers wanted to use their knowledge to gain wealth, they would. Thales was saying, I'm poor because I have other things I'm interested in doing than making money. So this is how true this story is, we don't know, but this is a story of Thales, who's considered to be the first of the ancient Greek philosophers. Anaximander lived between 610 and 547 BCE, and his teacher was Thales, but he disagreed with Thales. He said the ultimate stuff was not water, but somehow it was this thing he called the chaos, or the apeiron. And this was what he said, how everything came out of a chaos. And he also had an early theory of evolution, claiming that humans evolved from fish. So some historians believe that Anaximander was influenced by Eastern philosophy and this idea of the chaos, and we see this represented in the Eastern fish that I have presented here, of the yin and the yang, the chaos. Out of the chaos comes order of opposites. So that's Anaximander. Heraclitus. Heraclitus felt that the fundamental stuff was fire, and that everything like fire was always changing. If we ask the question, what is fire? Is it a solid, a liquid, a gas? Fire is a chemical reaction. So he said that reality itself is based on everything that we think is permanent and stable is actually in flux, like fire, always changing. So we can talk about fire simultaneously as something that is stable, that is being, and also something that is changing in constant flux, that is becoming. And therefore we traditionally view Heraclitus as a philosopher, a Greek philosopher of becoming, of change. And we find this tradition influencing humanism later in philosophy, and the ideas of human becomings rather than human beings. So he said we can understand something in its dichotomies, hot, cold, good, bad, dried, wet, that meaning manifests from opposites. And again, we can trace the postmodern, post-structuralist theories of Jacques Derrida back to Heraclitus's idea of deconstructing this opposition, deconstructing hot and cold, to find that within the understanding of hot is necessarily the understanding of cold, looking into these opposites. It's frequently said that the opposition to Heraclitus was Parmenides. And if Heraclitus said everything is always in flux, Parmenides said, no, everything is always stable and change is the illusion. He says, all change is an illusion and sensory experience cannot be real. The real can only be thought through the mind, through reason. So we look to Parmenides if to challenge any idea of objective empiricism, as the later British philosophers would focus on empirical objective science or philosophy, natural philosophy, and the French rationalists with René Descartes thought that reality is shaped in the mind, and we can trace this back to Parmenides, this idea of rationalism. Rational doesn't mean, as we discussed in our last lecture, doesn't mean reasonable. It means it exists in thought. And he said that Parmenides' idea here was that change and flux is an illusion of the sense organs, and that you don't trust your senses, you trust the permanency of thought. How different Parmenides and Heraclitus were in their thinking is up to debate. Again, Bertrand Russell discusses this in great detail in his book on the history of philosophy. So I really recommend you look into that. Hegel has some interesting things to discuss as well here. Zeno of Iliad. Things only look like they're moving. Motion is an illusion. And we come back to Zeno's paradox. And Zeno put forth a group of paradoxes that showed that we can be deceived by what our senses are telling us. Again, we need to turn to thought. So we have Zeno. It's important to point out that what we know about these Pre-Socratics is largely limited to what are called fragments, and fragments are just little snippets of the text that have survived through history, and these are largely accounts from Aristotle and Plato, sometimes Socrates, of what these individuals thought. So all of these things that we're studying here, it's commonly accepted that we really don't know exactly what these ancient Pre-Socratics taught and thought. And one of the most interesting critiques of this is Ancient Greek Thinking by Martin Heidegger, where he takes the fragments, these little fragments of some of these Pre-Socratics, and Anaximander in particular is his first one, and he discusses the problems of interpretation and of translation, and how largely what we know, as Hegel pointed out, what we know and what we think about these Pre-Socratics was shaped by 19th century German philosophy. So we take this as what we can understand from these fragments. So another thinker here is Pythagoras, and Pythagoras was an individual who looked to a theoretical concept as the foundation of the absolute, and that is mathematics. As you've studied in geometry, the Pythagorean Theorem, if you've studied music theory, you understand that Pythagoras was the individual who described the overtone series. That is, if you take a guitar string and you pluck it, you'll have a pitch. And if you divide that exactly in half, each of the two halves will play a pitch 1 octave higher. And if you keep subdividing them equally, you'll end up roughly with all the 12 chromatic scales of Western music, the 12 chromatic tones of Western music. This undergoes then some development later in history to develop Western music, but nevertheless, Pythagoras was a leader of a cult of mathematics, and this was a group of individuals who lived in southern Italy and in Sicily, the islands of Sicily and southern Italy, and worshipped numbers. And they had a group of rules and commandments, such as not to urinate facing the sun and not to eat beans, strong dietary rules, etc. And so for Pythagoras, the ultimate reality is numbers. Pythagoras later will influence Plato. Empedocles. Empedocles was an evolutionist like Anaximander. And he said what made Empedocles very interesting as a Pre-Socratic was he said that everything came from 4 things: earth, so solid; fire, which was thinking; air, breath of life or soul; and water, which is liquid. And he said there were 2 causes, love and strife. So in other words, attraction and repulsion, repelling. And he said that everything natural went through 4 recurring phases of life. That is, love dominates, so there's harmony within the 4 elements, and then strife disrupts this balance of the harmony. Then the 4 elements are completely separated by strife, and then they reintegrate it through love in a new mixture, and then we begin the cycle again. So this is an early evolutionary model of how nature changes, and this is by Anaximander. Democritus is very interesting for us today. Of course, again, we have another Renaissance or classical depiction of a pre-Socratic. So Democritus said that everything is made up of these indivisible things called atoms. And of course, the Greek word atom means indivisible. And he sounds, and his fragments sound contemporary, because he believed in 3 concepts that are very popular today in biological psychology and neuroscience, and that are reductionism, materialism, and determinism. And we discussed these last time, but to refresh your memory, reductionism is the idea that the more you reduce something into its smallest parts, the closer you get to its ultimate cause. Materialism is the idea that that ultimate cause is some sort of physical material substance. And determinism is the idea that that all of nature is governed by scientific deterministic laws. Again, if you recall, that could be genetic determinism or environmental determinism. Determinism is the idea that it has lawful behavior. These are all found in Democritus. And the idea of elementism, of breaking up things into component parts, is very much alive in ideas of mental mechanisms in cognitive psychology. The idea that there are mental facilities that are broken up in like a Swiss Army knife model of cognitive tasks in the brain, in the mind. And we turn to the Sophists. We have Gorgias, Protagoras, and Xenophanes. Protagoras is best known for his quote, "Man is the measure of all things." Xenophanes is one of the earliest thinkers who was a real critic of religion. Was one of his famous quotes is, "If cattle and horses or lions had hands, or were able to draw with their hands and do the work that men could do, they would draw the forms of their gods like horses, cattle, and they would make their bodies such as they each themselves had." And this was restated perhaps more eloquently by Voltaire, in that man is not made in the image of God, God is made in the image of man. So again, remember the Sophists as being individuals who believed that truth was relative and largely dependent on rhetoric or on words. And these were, the Sophists were very much criticized by Plato and Aristotle, as well as Socrates. However, Socrates, in his way of thinking, had a lot of similarity with the Sophists. So Protagoras, there's no universal truth. Nothing is false, but some beliefs are more useful than others. We're going to see this coming into American pragmatic philosophy, pragmatism of C.S. Peirce and John Dewey and William James. And man never steps into the same river once. Not the same river twice, the same river once. So here we find a postcard. And this postcard was made famous by Jacques Derrida, who wrote an entire essay called The Postcard on this. Again, Jacques Derrida was a post-structuralist thinker of the 20th century. And what we find interesting about this postcard is we see a figure here, Plato, whispering into the ears of Socrates, and Socrates is writing. Now, if you know anything about the history of philosophy, you'll understand why this postcard, this medieval engraving, is so fascinating. And that is because Socrates never wrote anything down. Socrates largely gathered in the Agora, he's in the town square in Athens, and he spoke to people, he challenged them, he asked many questions, and but he never wrote anything down. Everything we know that Socrates says was through the mouth of Plato, was through the writings of Plato. So in Plato's 25 dialogues that he wrote, we have the Socrates as the star of many of these dialogues. In other words, Plato wrote what Socrates said, presumably. And this points back to an interesting distinction. Friedrich Nietzsche would later not refer to the philosophers who came before Socrates as pre-Socratics, but instead referred to them, perhaps more accurately, as pre-Platonic thinkers. And he also criticized that Socrates would not have been the first philosopher, but Plato would have been. But this is the significance of this postcard and why it's so important for us to think about. Remember, Socrates was in the oral tradition. He refused to write things down. Plato wrote in the dialogues what Socrates said. So Socrates we can refer to as a character featured in Plato's dialogues. So here we see Socrates, depiction of Socrates 470-399 BCE, and he was known as the what is philosopher. He was the gadfly. He was the person who would go up to people and ask them a question and then begin to continuously ask these repeated questions about the answers they'd given, which eventually would end in the individual being very frustrated and leaving because Socrates would unveil to them or come to show them that what they thought they knew they didn't know at all. So he used inductive definition. So he starts with an example of things in his description, and then he looks at all the instances. What do they all have in common? He then questions everything, like the Sophists, but he felt that the truth was actually discoverable. He just never got to the truth. He said the truth was the essence of something. And at the age of 70, Socrates was sentenced to death. One of Plato's most famous dialogues is the trial and death of Socrates. So Socrates was tried for teaching the young people of Athens to question everything, including the government, and this didn't settle very well with the government officials, so he was sentenced to death. The famous story goes that he was given the opportunity to escape, but he refused to. And it was once posed. The question was posed by one of the thinkers about Socrates: if he were 25, would he have stuck around, or would he have escaped, or would he have been offered the option to escape? Socrates was a war hero. Here we have a video that I would encourage you to take a look at. It's by a now deceased professor of philosophy named Rick Roderick, and he is one of the most engaging and interesting professors that you can hear speak on the topic of Socrates. And we'll add a link to this video below so you can watch it. But Socrates, or Roderick, actually introduces some very interesting concepts of Socrates and frames him very nicely. So now we turn to Plato. Plato, 427 to 347 BCE. He wrote 25 dialogues. He was a body-soul dualist. When we will learn later that when Christianity enters into the West, this is the mixture of Judaism and Platonic philosophy. So Plato, in his dialogues, discussed this idea of a transcendent soul that separated from the body when one dies. This is where the Christian idea of an eternal soul comes from. We have no mention of an afterlife, of an eternal soul living in an afterlife in the Jewish writings. We see these enter into the text with Christian writings. So this is the Christianity is often described as a mixture of ancient Greek philosophy with Judaic, Hebrew Judaic philosophy, religious views. And of course, the Gospels of Jesus were originally written in Greek and are largely a collection of letters and interactions in the Greek world. So later in Plato, he shifts into a more mysticism, and it's said that he went and studied and was a part of the Pythagorean cult. at some point, and this was after Socrates was murdered. And this is an interesting aspect of things as well. People often ask, why didn't Plato write in his own voice? Well, it's very interesting to realize that if your teacher was sentenced to death for what he had said, and you were worried that this could happen to you, it might be safer to write in the voice of someone else. So this is another distinction that Nietzsche points out, that maybe Plato's use of Socrates as the character was a safe way to be able to say, hey, I didn't say it, Socrates did. I'm just writing it down to avoid this type of persecution. Some of the topics that Plato wrote on: theory of forms, the analogy of the divided line, the allegory of the cave, reminiscence theory of knowledge, nature of the soul, sleep and dreams. Again, if you look in the writings of Plato, the Republic in particular, and every time you see the word psyche or you see the word soul, think of mind, you'll have a contemporary philosophy book. And again, I'd want to turn your attention to a video I'm putting a link below by Bryan Magee, interview with Miles Burnyeat, and that is an introduction to Plato. It's an excellent introduction to the philosophy of Plato. I'll put a number of links in the description for you to further explore the ideas of Plato and others. One of Plato's descriptions is the analogy of the divided line. And this is really important for us in psychology because it discusses what is his theory of what is the most, can we say, accurate or authentic or useful representation of things. And we see the divided line. Here's the division. And he says things like paintings, photographs, images are the lowest form of understanding. So like a photograph or a paint, he didn't say photograph, of course, but contemporarily we're incorporating this. Paintings and photographs or any type of image is a lowest form of understanding. He said then we get to things like looking at things, so the world. And this is a step up from looking at a representation of something. We're closer to it, but it's still just a perception. He said then we get to geometry. And he said geometry gets us closer to reality than anything else. It's an abstraction. Now, here's the thing about geometry. We're not talking about Arabic numerical or algebraic geometry. We're talking about geometry as geometric, in other words, ratios and relationships. The numerical, the Arabic, Arabian numeral system of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, etc., did not enter into geometry until the Middle Ages. So we're looking here at the end of the Middle Ages. So we're looking here at geometry as the study of shapes in ratio, in relationship to one another. And finally he said there were these abstract forms that existed in what we might call heaven. And these abstract forms were what existed, and anything that we understand was merely a copy or a model of the abstract form. So there was an abstract form in the world of, say, a rabbit, a bunny. And anytime we saw something that was similar to this abstract ideal of the bunny, we referred to it as a bunny. But that bunny in itself was not a perfect thing in itself. It wasn't reality. It was referencing some abstract form in the heavens. The allegory of the cave, you can see many videos online explaining this, or read it. And this is Plato's famous allegory in which he said we as individuals are chained to chairs facing a wall, and behind us there's a fire, and there are individuals, this is culture and society, who are taking things and passing them in front of the fire, and we're seeing shadows on the wall, and we have no ability to look back and see here, and all we see are the shadows. And we come to believe, because we grew up being indoctrinated into this, that those shadows are the things in themselves. And as the story goes, Plato said that one day an individual loosens their chains somehow, they get themselves loose, and they begin to look back, and they say, oh my goodness, this is not reality. And they climb out of the cave, and as they climb towards the reality out of the world into the sunlight of knowledge and reason and logic, their eyes hurt and they want to turn back, but eventually their eyes acclimate and they see reality. So in other words, this would be the reality of the heavenly forms. And then it's their responsibility, because they now become philosopher kings, to go back down into the cave and enlighten these individuals. And when they do return down here, these folks say, "You're crazy, you're nuts, this is reality, what's wrong with you?" So the individual who's actually enlightened, Plato says, comes off to the rest of the world as being irrational or psychotic. And so this is the allegory of the cave, that things are not what we think they are, and that there's a process through philosophy to become a philosopher king. We also find in Plato's dialogue of the Phaedrus his golden chariot metaphor. And this we find repeating, of course, in Freud. This is probably where Freud got this model of the psyche or of the soul, and that is Plato described a white horse that was righteous and always doing what was socially acceptable and what was governed by the rules of society. He said that there was this lascivious horse, a dark horse, who was always looking to serve desires and cravings. And then there was a chariot driver. And this chariot driver's job was to manage to keep these two horses going in some direction that the ego was determining. Yes, the ego, the chariot driver. So of course we can understand this as the me, the myself, the ego of commonly described in Freudian theory. The superego, this demanding, tyrannical, you should, don't sin and follow the rules horse. And this equally tyrannical, lascivious, desiring horse for sex and hunger and power and all these things. And so we find in Plato the one of the earliest descriptions of Freud's id, ego, and superego. Here's a list of the themes from Plato's dialogues, and we see the breadth of topics in this: courage and virtue, verbal trickery and obedience to law, truth and language, the idea of moderation and the idea of knowing oneself. We have issues on friendship. There's just such a rich. We really say that Plato, that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And we really see that represented nicely in this list of the 25 dialogues. Here's number 21 on the Sophists, and this is his discussion against the Sophists. Again, and Gorgias is another essay where he's critical of the Sophists. Phaedrus is very interesting to us in media psychology. This is where he discusses how knowledge and thinking changes, switching from an oral to a written culture. And we come up with this identical issue in the Phaedrus when we had television introduced into culture, and radio and print media, mass media, and of course the internet and television. We refer back to the Phaedrus and find ourselves having identical conversations that were had in ancient Greek. Now we go to Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato's. It should be pointed out that Plato and Socrates were friends. They knew one another, but it's not clear that Plato was a student of Socrates. They're more like colleagues. He was born in Macedonia. He was the son of a physician. I guess what we know is the most famous fact about Aristotle is that he was the tutor of Alexander the Great. So being the teacher of Alexander the Great, he had great notoriety and political influence. He founded a school in Athens called the Lyceum, and it's considered to be the world's first university. And the interesting thing is, after the death of Alexander the Great, Macedonian government in Athens was overthrown, and Aristotle became the focus of legal allegations by the new government. So he fled to Macedonia, stating that he would not give Athens a chance to sin a second time against philosophy. So what he was saying here is his political influence on Alexander the Great once new individuals came into power, he was called into question for for being an influence on Alexander the Great, and he feared for his own life. He feared that what happened to Socrates would happen to him, and so he left ancient Greece. And one of his most famous books for psychologists is called On the Soul, De Anima, and it's considered to be the first history of psychology. So we're going to take a look at some of the basic concepts of Aristotle. Really, we remember Aristotle's pointing down at the earth. He's saying natural philosophy, whereas Plato's pointing up to the heavens, saying the ideal forms. Remember the picture by Raphael. So we understand Aristotle has 4 causes of things, not just one cause. He has an overdetermined 4 causes, and he describes things as having material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. And Aristotle's 4 causes, the example is what causes or is an explanatory factor in wood and other materials becoming houses and furniture. So he said that we examine each of these causes, and there's an action involved in each of these. And the word explanation or cause is an action. So the material cause would be that out of which a thing comes to be and which persists. So material from what it comes from, so stone or wood. That's the material cause. The formal cause would be the idea of patterns, that to in which something is made, the intention, the form or the archetype, the statement of the essence. So the design or the blueprint would be the formal cause. So we have the material cause and the formal cause quite separate. The efficient cause would be the act of doing it, so the person making the thing, the primary source of change coming to rest, that by which something is produced. Interestingly enough, we see this language manifest again later in Heidegger's works. The final cause, and that is the intended outcome. So the cause of something that's the final cause would be furniture or a house or a place to live, that for the sake of which the end product is made. We understand that meaning is rooted in all of these causes. Meaning is a part of all of this. We give meaning to an object based on our intention with it and the role it plays in the structure of the complex structure with other things in the environment. Aristotle also talked about teleology rather than cause and effect. So teleology is the idea that something is pulled towards its end form rather than pushed from behind. So a teleological view will manifest in Alfred Adler's psychoanalytic, individual psychoanalytic psychology. And this is the idea that we're not pushed from behind in a cause and effect fashion, but we're pulled towards a goal. Humanists will look at this as well, humanist psychology. So the idea here is you're not watching this video because you're being caused to by some pressure telling you should be watching it. Theologically speaking, you're watching these lectures because you're being pulled towards some idea you have of your ideal self, as Adler would describe. So you're being pulled towards a goal. In the entelechy, this is everything has a purpose within itself. The famous this is very tightly intertwined with teleology. The famous example here is that within the acorn there is an oak. There is the potential for the oak tree. All things have souls, and there are 3 types of souls according to Aristotle's descriptive categorization. That's the vegetative soul, meaning that it grows, a sensitive soul, its growth, and it has a nervous system, and a rational soul, meaning it can think. So, of course, humans have all of these souls, these 3 aspects of the soul. Vegetative, we grow, we're sensitive, we have nervous systems, and we think. We have growth and rationality and thinking. Remember, rational again means thinking. And all of these senses are processed and synthesized in the heart. He said this is where all the senses become common. What is translated as common sense, which is a little different than how we use the term common sense today. And he said there are different ways of reasoning and thinking. And he said active reason is deep thought, and passive reason is everyday thought, like accepted ways of doing things. And common sense is a synthesized area of the senses in the heart. And sensory experience is direct sensation. It's important to realize that the heart is the second most innervated organ of the body, next to the brain. And that today in embodied cognition, we talk about the role of the heart in decision making, as well as the rest of the body. Some other things that Aristotle discussed: memory and emotion and imagination. Aristotle is really believed to be the philosopher who was the predecessor to contemporary scientific natural science. Categorization. You see a lot of categorization in Aristotle's writing, putting things into categorization of physics and metaphysics. The metaphysics was the book that came after the physics of the natural world. So physical is anything that's physical, metaphysical is anything that's outside of the physical. We now use metaphysics in philosophy to talk about the idea of existence and things of this nature. We'll cover later in this course. So here we have to some of the other topics. Human behavior is directed towards decreasing pain and increasing pleasure. We see this as a later influence in behaviorism. The most pleasure comes from thinking. So he said that if you want to have a good life, an enjoyable life, choose the life of the mind. And he said some people do not think, but only seek pleasure and avoid pain. He said this is close to animals. So for Aristotle, the person who just lives from the gut, Plato would have described these people as the bronze individuals, that they are closer to animals than those who live from the mind, the life of the mind. In memory research, you can look into Aristotle's laws of association, which were a great influence on behaviorist rules of conditioning. The law of contiguity: when we think of something, we are thinking of things that occur with it. Law of contrast: when we think of something, we think of its opposite. Law of similarity: when we think of something, we think of things similar to it. And the law of frequency: the more often two experiences occur together, the stronger they become associated. Here we see so much influence in cognitive psychology and in behaviorism. Aristotle referred to emotion as a form of thinking, a form of cognition. He called it affected thinking. And desire, hate, or fear alters what is perceived. So he was examining, this is an area of psychology that would be a great research area. He was understanding how emotion was active in thinking and perception. You know this, of course, when you are in love versus when you get dumped. When you're in love, someone cut you off and it's okay. There's bigger things in life, and I'm in love after all, and everything's good. But if you get dumped and someone cuts you off, you might find yourself taking out your anger of being jilted and dumped on the person who cut you off in the car. So this is the idea of emotion affecting thinking. Imagination is the lingering effect of sensory experience. Dreaming is pure memory without reason or sensory associations. That's a very fascinating view of memory. Of dreaming, that when we're dreaming, we're having memories that are not connected logically or rationally and have no sensory input. And dreams occur about what we experienced in the waking life. And finally, we turn to just a little chart that illustrates some differences between Plato and his student Aristotle. So Plato sought truths and Aristotle sought truths. So this made them both distinctly hostile towards the Sophists, who felt that there were relative truths, not universal truths. But Plato said truth is found through thinking and introspection, and that the senses lie. So Plato is in the rationalist tradition. Aristotle said that truth is found by observing nature, and the senses are reliable. So we often point to Aristotle as the origin of the British empirical objective position, an of natural science. And Plato said that search for essence, the fundamental stuff, is through thinking. And Aristotle said the search for the essences, in other words, the fundamental stuff, is found here on earth in nature. And Plato said we should be looking at mathematics as our model for doing thinking. And Aristotle said we should be looking at classification and categories. Now, I want to conclude this lecture by just pointing something out. We are talking about interpretations of these philosophers and their words. In philosophy, we have arguments. We continue a conversation throughout history, and my goal in this lecture and in this series of lectures is to introduce to you these philosophers primarily how they will be of interest to you as a psychologist, either a research psychologist or a therapeutic psychologist, someone who's interested in understanding how philosophy is important for psychology and how psychology grows out of philosophy. But I'm not looking to teach you how things are. I'm teaching you a interpretation. And this happens to be, most of what I'm telling you is the most commonly, traditionally understood interpretation of these philosophers. Of course, you read their works and you come to your own conclusion. This is simply serving as an introduction, showing you where to look. And hopefully you won't take this as the definitive end discussion of these philosophers. Much of what I've said in here is accepted by most people who think about these things. There are other aspects of it that it would be very controversial. So an example of that would be the pre-Socratic versus pre-Platonic designation, the designation of modern and postmodernism, and even the understanding of analytic and continental philosophies. So these are all contentious areas within the field. And I'd like to point you finally to this video, Martha Nussbaum, interviewed by Bryan Magee on Aristotle, another excellent resource that I will provide a link for you in the description below. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and this will conclude our second lecture on the Pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.